After this video, you should have a grasp on what REST APIs are and how to leverage them. It should give you the tools necessary to talk to other software over the internet with your Java code. Howdy, hackers and homies. Welcome to A Hot Cup of Java. I'm your host today, Lexi, a full-stack engineer with a specialty in Java. Today, we'll be looking at REST APIs, a critical piece of modern software that any well-rounded developer should be familiar with. REST stands for Representational State Transfer. As I'm sure you could guess, that means taking a representation for state of something and transferring it. More literally, it means representing the state of an object as a JSON object and sending that to a URL that sort of defines where the object is in a hierarchy. And this transfer also uses a method that more or less defines what kind of action is going to happen. JSON, or JavaScript Object Notation, is a pretty simple way of representing an object as a bunch of key value pairs. The values allowed are also pretty basic. In terms of primitives, you could have a string, number, boolean, or null. You can also have one of two structures as your value, a list or another JSON. Here's a basic example of a JSON representing an item you might see on a restaurant's menu. Name is a string that tells you what the item is called. Price is a number that tells you how much the item costs. We have in stock, which is a boolean saying whether the item can be served. Ingredients here is just a list of the names of food involved. And then under accommodations, we have an example of null. We communicate these objects back and forth with a variety of methods. There's a whole bunch of them, but the four basic ones are get, put, post, and delete. And we call these methods to a URL with endpoints, which are extra words separated by dashes, to communicate what and where the resource is. The method get to a specific endpoint is like saying, send me the object that is here. Inversely, delete to the same endpoint would mean stop storing the object that is here. Put would mean change the object that is here to the one that I give you. And post means save this as a new object here at this location. Here's our restaurant example. For instance, calling getMyRestaurant.com/foods/meatloaf would be equivalent to I'd like the meatloaf. Then the API would bring you back your meatloaf JSON, just like a server might with a real meatloaf. Calling delete on the same endpoint would instead be like saying stop serving meatloaf because you just don't like it. Using put with an object that just has a price value, say at $15, would mean start charging $15 for meatloaf instead. While using post with the previous object to myrestaurant.com/foods would be like saying, now you should serve burgers as well. Implementing this with core Java was pretty confusing until Java 11. 11 introduced a new system that splits it up into three basic components. HTTP client is the main interface and is used for establishing the connection and trading your requests and responses over the URL. HTTP request is used for creating the initial request that you send out. You use this to structure what you want to send. The URL you use, the method, the JSON you send if it's put or post, and any headers you may want on the request as well. HTTP response is what the client returns when you send a request. It's how you access things like the status code, the JSON it sends back if there is one, and any headers that it may have sent back. In a moment, we'll look at how we can use this to create a Reddit bot, but first, I want you to consider this for a moment. If I had an application that stored music and I wanted to save a new pop song, What method and endpoint would I use to send an object for this song? I'd love to see what y'all come up with in the comments. So as you can see, we have this basic starter package here, this project, empty main method, and just some boilerplate code that I started out with, which we'll walk through pretty briefly. So this credentials is for storing the API token, which we'll use in our requests, and you'll see how that gets implemented later. It's basically to avoid logging in to tell them that, hey, we're an actual user and we have so-and-so permissions. And it reads this token from a properties file that I've put in here. And that properties file looks like this. And so the credentials file just reads it from that. And then this get token method will pull our token as we need it to. So that's what that's doing. And then we have our empty API caller method. This is where we're going to call the APIs. Right now, it just has our URL for Reddit's API. We'll fill that out later once we're done. Then I have this interface for request object. Now, this is for turning an existing object into a string that we can send over an API and have it represent a certain type of body that an API might request, right? So we tell it what kind of body is over the content type, which we'll see how that gets used later. And then we have the convert method, and that formats it into whatever kind of object we need to send through to represent the state. And then we also have get values, simply because that's going to carry over to implementations of the interface for the convert method. And so we also have an implementation here at the ready, request JSON. It's pretty boring, kind of complicated code. You can look at it on your own, but basically it takes an object that extends this abstract class and it makes it so that object can convert based on whatever values it puts in the getValues method, which you'll notice we made abstract, so any implementing class can then implement that to show what needs to turn into a JSON and how. So with that, let's go ahead and build a class for our request payload. And that, we're going to make a text post. Now, this is just going to be your basic post with some text inside of it. And I already have this empty subreddit that I created specifically for this. You notice there's no post in it yet, so let's go ahead and change that with our new Reddit bot. So a text post, the information that we're going to need is the subreddit. We're also going to need the title, and we're going to need the text. And so let's go ahead and make the constructor take all of that information. And this is basic, more boilerplate items, but and the documentation for how these APIs work and what they're expecting in terms of the payloads and the endpoints, those are going to be found in the description. So you guys can explore that as you want. For now, I'm just going to go ahead and I'm not going to show it in this just to keep things in scope. And so we're going to go ahead and instead extend the request JSON. And this is going to require us to implement the getValues method. And so we need to create a map of strings and object. And that's going to be the values. Let's just go ahead and use a hash map. It's a pretty good default. Values.put. And so we're going to do the title. And that's going to take title. Pretty simple. Text is going to take text, and the property that it's actually expecting for subreddit is just called SR. So that's what we're going to do there, but for our own readability, we're using subreddit. And so other values are also required for this. So we need kind, and that needs to say self. And then we also need put the API type, I believe. Yeah, and that needs JSON. This isn't saying what we're sending through, it's saying what we want to receive back. And these are basically saying, so kind self is saying that this is just a text-based post and read that based on the fact that we have text here. And then this is just saying, send us back a JSON. Don't send us to, the HTML page that has the post, like it would if you made an actual post in the browser. So that's about it for what we need for text posts. So let's go into our bot and let's go ahead and make one. And then let's look at what the JSON looks like when we do that. First, our subreddit is Hot Cup of Java. Our title is Hello World. And let's keep it classic with beep, boop, I'm a bot. Any Redditors out there might recognize that sort of style. And then to start out, let's just look at what the convert method shows us. We're just going to print out post.convert. And what that's going to show, is an error because I forgot to actually return the map. I have a bad habit of that. So let's go ahead and fix that. And we see here, this is what a JSON looks like, unindented, without formatting or white space. We just see properties, key, value, that kind of thing, surrounded by brackets. This is a pretty basic JSON. So that's that structure. And so let's go into the API caller. And another property we want to keep is our HTTP client, which is what we're going to use to trade requests back and forth. And created when we initially construct this. And we're just going to go with the basic HTTP client. We don't need any fancy adjustments or customizations for this implementation, so we're just doing that for now. And then we'll go ahead and do string make post. And it's going to take a text post. Now we're returning a string because that's actually what we're going to take our response body as. And we'll see how that works in a little bit. But first, we need to build our request. HTTP request. Now it uses builder structure. So we're going to follow this builder pattern and take it one step at a time. The first thing we need is our URI, which is going to be Reddit, which is this URL up here. And then our endpoint, which our first object is, we're going to the API, and then we're going to submit. But a string alone does not actually suffice. It needs to be a URI object, and that's actually going to throw an exception. So we are going to need to throw that exception in our signature as well. And then we need a few headers. So the first header we want is authorization, and this is where that token is going to come into play with OAuth. You can look into that on your own later, but for now, just know we take the token and we put it in this header on our request, prepended with bearer. And so that will tell it that this is a bearer token, and that's what we're using for authorizing. And then we also want another header to tell them what we're actually getting. And so we're going to send a content type through, and that is where content type comes in from our request object. And so we can see when we do request JSON, that's going to be application JSON. And then we also want to send it with post, and we do a body publisher. So that's to tell it what exactly it can use as a body. And we're just going to use strings for now. And then we're going to take our token or our request body and convert it. And that's all there is to it for building a request. So now we have our request and our client to trade it across. And so when we send it over the client, we're expecting an HTTP response. And we're actually going to take that response object as a string, and we'll tell it to do it that way when we send it through. So we'll send a request, and then we'll also do a body handler, and we're going to do of string for that as well. So the body is going to be a string. The request object we receive will have all of the same stuff to it, though. And then we have these exceptions as expected. We're just going to throw them upwards for now because this is a pretty simple implementation. And so let's just go ahead, log our status code. Let's do status code. And we're going to do response status code. And then we're going to just return our response body as the return of this method. And so if we go in and we make our API caller, and then we take caller and we make our post, and let's just surround this with a try catch. I'm not terribly concerned because we won't get exceptions so much as error messages back from the API, right? Let's get rid of this. So let's go ahead and run it and see what happens. We got a status code 200. Now, let's take a look, see if the post is here. And, oh no, there's no posts yet. So what exactly happens? Now, we can find out what happened by actually looking at our response body, right? And this isn't going to be terribly helpful, but in general, it's good debugging practice to look at what it sent back. And it's a little unreadable, but if you go through, you'll notice error, bad subreddit name. And it can be confusing when you get this at first, but the reality is because the text post is going in as a JSON, and even though that's the most common for APIs, that's not actually what Reddit takes. It's a very old API. It actually takes encoded form data. So we need to create a new request object for encoded form data. And luckily, this is why we set it up for interface system like this so that we can make it as flexible as possible. We're going to make another abstract class. Oh, actually, I don't want to do that part quite yet, simply because I want the easy implement methods here. And now let's make it abstract, just so I don't have to type all of that. Get values, we're going to make an abstract method because that's implemented by our text post. And then content type, we're actually going to make application x www form URL encoded. Now the structure that these actually use looks less like a JSON and more like this. And then we would have param2 equals test, and so on and so forth for our object. These values are going to be encoded in standard URL encoding, which we'll see how to do that when we implement our convert. So first we're going to get the values, we're going to get a key set, and we're going to stream that to map it. And so what we're going to do is map it so it is key plus the equal sign, and then plus URL encoder, encode, and we want to cast this to a string. We want to take get values, get our object from there, And then we want to tell it what char set it's using, which is going to be UTF-8. And then we want to concatenate all of these together with good old and sign. I believe it's called an ampersand. I'm not as familiar. But that will format it in the proper encoded form data that we actually need. And then actually fixing it is as simple as changing what we extend. And because we used this sort of polymorphic interface system, it works all the same. And so now, if we give it a try, got a 200, no errors, and our payload looks very different, so that's promising. And would you look at this, we refresh the page, and we have our post. And that's how it's done. And with that, we've officially done something pretty cool with REST APIs in Java. To recap, we've covered what REST APIs are and how they work as a general concept. We've also discussed how you would implement REST API calls in core Java. And most importantly, we went and did something cool with it, which admittedly bots can be annoying to some. To close out, I'd like to mention that the best way to understand how code works is to code it. So go ahead and try it yourself with any APIs you can find. If you want to make a Reddit bot like we did, feel free to use the same starting code that I did. I only ask that you keep it to the same subreddit I've made for this. Let's not bother the general public, yeah? I'd also challenge you to take a step beyond. See if you can make this as a jumping off point and make the bot also leave a comment on your thread. Or have it leave a comment on mine. That'd be pretty cool too. I look forward to seeing y'all's work in action. But for now, catch you later, coders.